What if the person a billionaire tried to buy had already changed his life years before he ever met her? The desert air outside Phoenix cooled quickly after sunset, but inside the private ballroom of the Alaris Grand Resort the atmosphere was warm, quiet, and strangely tense. Crystal chandeliers glowed above rows of carefully arranged tables where some of the wealthiest people in America sat in calm silence, each of them holding a small black bidding card. To an outsider, it looked like a charity gala, the kind where donors quietly pledge money to causes the public never hears about. But tonight's gathering was something far more unusual. Tonight was the Legacy Auction, an invitation-only event where billionaires solved personal problems with numbers written on cards. At the center of the room stood a polished stage with a single podium, and beside it a woman in her early 30s shifted nervously under the soft lights. Her name was Sarah Bennett. She wore a borrowed navy dress and a pair of shoes that were half a size too small, and although she tried to stand confidently, her hands remained tightly folded in front of her. Sarah wasn't wealthy. She wasn't powerful. In fact, just 48 hours earlier she had been working a late shift at a diner outside Mesa while wondering how she would pay rent before the end of the month. But desperate situations open doors people never imagine walking through, and Sarah had received a message that promised something impossible, a chance to secure her son's future. Across the room, seated quietly near the back, a man watched the stage without showing a single emotion. Alexander Reed was 39 years old and worth more than $8 billion, the founder of one of the fastest-growing artificial intelligence companies in the world. His black suit was simple, his posture relaxed, but everyone in the room knew exactly who he was. When Alexander Reed lifted his bidding card, deals happened. Investments shifted. Entire companies changed direction. Yet tonight he wasn't here for business expansion or venture capital opportunities. Tonight he was here for something deeply personal, something he had spent years trying to solve. The auction host cleared his throat and spoke calmly into the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for supporting tonight's private foundation initiative. As always, all arrangements are handled legally and confidentially. Our final opportunity this evening involves a contractual family partnership designed to assist both parties with long-term security. A few quiet murmurs traveled across the room. Everyone knew what that meant. Wealth had many advantages, but it couldn't solve everything. Legacy mattered to people like this. Heirs mattered. Futures mattered. The host continued, gesturing towards Sarah. Miss Sarah Bennett is a single mother from Arizona seeking financial stability for her family. In exchange for a legally structured family arrangement, a partner will receive full parental rights to a future child, while Miss Bennett receives financial support and lifetime security. The explanation was delivered with careful professionalism, but the meaning was clear enough. Some people in the room leaned back in their chairs, uninterested. Others studied Sarah thoughtfully, calculating possibilities the same way they evaluated investments. Sarah's heart pounded so loudly she was sure the microphone might pick it up. She wasn't here because she wanted to be. She was here because medical bills didn't care about pride, and the small apartment she shared with her 6-year-old son had an eviction notice taped to the door that morning. She had told herself that if no one bid, she would walk away and pretend this night had never happened. The host lifted his hand. Opening offer is $1 million. A few seconds passed. No movement. Then someone near the center slowly raised a card. 1 million, the host confirmed. Sarah forced herself to breathe. Maybe this would really work. Another bidder lifted his card. 2 million. A third voice from the far side of the room said calmly, 3. The numbers climbed quickly, the way they always did when wealthy people competed over something rare. For million. 4.5. 5. Sarah barely heard the numbers anymore, because her thoughts kept drifting back to the small hospital room where her son Liam had fallen asleep earlier that afternoon while she promised him everything would be okay. She didn't know if this was the right choice, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Doing nothing would guarantee failure. Then suddenly the room went quiet again. The host looked toward the back table. Alexander Reed had raised his card. His voice was calm, steady, and unmistakably confident. $5 million. A ripple moved through the audience. Several bidders lowered their cards immediately. When Alexander Reed made a decision, most people understood the competition was already over. The host waited a moment, scanning the room. 5 million going once. Silence. 5 million going twice. Sarah felt the world slow down around her. The man who had just placed the winning bid hadn't even looked at her yet. He simply sat there, composed, as if this were the most ordinary transaction in the world. Sold. The gavel tapped softly against the podium. Applause followed, polite but brief. The contract would be signed later that evening. But as Sarah stepped down from the stage and finally walked past the quiet table near the back of the room, Alexander Reed looked up for the first time. His eyes met hers for only a second, and something in that moment shifted in a way neither of them understood yet. Because the billionaire believed he had just purchased the future he wanted. What he didn't know was that the most important part of that future had already been waiting for him long before tonight. The ballroom slowly emptied as the final guests finished their quiet conversations, and expensive glasses of sparkling water were cleared from the tables. But Sarah Bennett still felt as if she were standing in the center of a spotlight that refused to turn off. A woman from the foundation guided her through a side corridor toward a private conference room where the paperwork would be completed. The hallway carpet was thick and silent beneath her shoes, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and citrus cleaner. Everything about the resort felt carefully controlled and impossibly expensive, the kind of place where people solve problems with signatures instead of stress. Sarah tried to steady her breathing as the door opened. Inside the room sat Alexander Reed, already reviewing a stack of documents laid neatly across a glass table. A middle-aged attorney stood beside him, adjusting a pair of silver glasses while scanning the paperwork one more time. When Sarah entered, Alexander looked up with the same calm expression he had worn all evening. Up close, he seemed younger than she expected, maybe late 30s, with dark hair, steady eyes, and the kind of quiet confidence that only came from years of success. "Miss Bennett," the attorney said politely, gesturing toward the chair across from Alexander. "Please have a seat." Sarah sat down slowly, folding her hands together so no one would see them tremble. The attorney introduced himself as Victor Hale, Alexander Reed's legal advisor. His voice carried the practiced tone of someone who had negotiated hundreds of high-value agreements. "Everything tonight will follow a fully legal family partnership structure," he explained carefully. "This contract guarantees financial stability for you and your existing child, along with full medical support and housing security. In exchange, Mr. Reed will receive parental rights to a future child conceived during the marriage." The word marriage felt strange when spoken aloud. Sarah had known the arrangement required a legal union, but hearing it described so formally made the situation feel suddenly real. Victor slid the contract toward her across the table. The document was thick, nearly 30 pages long, with multiple highlighted sections. "You will receive $5 million deposited into a trust account," he continued. "Additionally, Mr. Reed will provide a home, health coverage, and educational security for your son Liam until he reaches adulthood." Hearing her son's name spoken inside a room like this made Sarah's chest tighten. For years, every decision in her life had revolved around Liam. The long shifts at the diner, the small apartment with peeling paint, the constant calculations about rent, groceries, and doctor visits. Everything came back to that little boy who believed his mother could fix anything. Alexander finally spoke, his voice calm and direct. "Your situation was explained to me before the auction. I understand that your son has medical expenses. Those will be handled immediately." Sarah looked at him for the first time since entering the room. His tone was not cold exactly, but it carried the clear distance of someone used to solving problems through transactions. "Why me?" she asked quietly before she could stop herself. Victor glanced toward Alexander, but the billionaire answered without hesitation. "Because you meet the requirements I was given." Sarah blinked. "Requirements?" Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair. "Health history, age, genetic background, stability." He paused for a moment before adding, "And because you were willing to step forward." The explanation sounded almost clinical, yet there was no cruelty in his voice. He simply spoke the truth the way someone might explain a business deal. Victor cleared his throat gently. "Of course the marriage will remain private. Publicly you will be presented as Mr. Reed's spouse. Internally the contract will define the arrangement." Sarah studied the pages again. Legal language filled every paragraph, but certain phrases stood out clearly. Financial security, parental rights, confidentiality, duration of marriage, minimum 2 years, She noticed a small velvet box placed near the end of the table. Inside rested a simple diamond ring, elegant but not flashy. The symbol of an agreement that felt less like a fairy tale and more like a carefully structured plan. Sarah thought about the eviction notice taped to her apartment door that morning. She thought about Liam asleep in the hospital waiting room while she promised him that things would get better. Then she looked back at Alexander Reed. "If I sign this," she said slowly, "my son is protected. Completely." Alexander met her gaze without hesitation. "Yes." The certainty in his voice felt heavier than the $5 million written on the contract. For the first time all night, Sarah realized that this decision would change every part of her life, not just her financial problems. But sometimes the future arrives disguised as an impossible choice. Victor slid a pen toward her. The room fell silent. Sarah took the pen and signed her name at the bottom of the final page. The sound of the pen against paper seemed louder than the auction gavel had been earlier. Victor nodded once, satisfied, and turned the contract toward Alexander. Without hesitation, the billionaire signed as well. When the final page was complete, Victor gathered the documents neatly and stood. "Congratulations," he said calmly. "The agreement is now official." Sarah exhaled slowly, unsure whether the feeling in her chest was relief or fear. Alexander opened the small velvet box and lifted the ring. For a brief moment, he studied it, as if confirming a final detail in a much larger plan. Then he stood and stepped closer to her chair. "We should make this look believable," he said quietly. Sarah extended her hand. The ring slid into place with surprising ease. In that moment, the contract stopped feeling like paperwork and started feeling like a doorway she had already walked through. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Because although the agreement had just been finalized, neither Sarah nor Alexander realized that the most important part of their story had not even begun to reveal itself yet. The desert sky above Phoenix was still dark when Sarah Bennett woke the next morning, and for a moment she forgot where she was. The room around her was quiet, enormous compared to the small apartment she had left behind only hours earlier. Soft sunlight began to push through the tall windows, reflecting off polished wooden floors and walls that seemed almost too perfect to touch. For several seconds, she lay still beneath the unfamiliar blankets, listening to the silence. Then the events of the previous night returned all at once. The auction, the contract, the ring that now rested lightly on her left hand. Sarah lifted her hand slowly, studying the small diamond as if it belonged to someone else. Only 24 hours earlier, she had been calculating whether the money in her bank account could cover groceries for the week. Now she was legally married to one of the richest men in the country. The thought felt impossible, like something she might wake up from if she closed her eyes again. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Bennett," a polite voice called through the door. Sarah sat up quickly. "Yes." The door opened, and a woman in a tailored gray suit stepped inside carrying a tablet. "Good morning. My name is Angela. Mr. Reed asked me to assist you today. Breakfast is ready downstairs whenever you are comfortable." Sarah nodded awkwardly, unsure how to respond to someone who clearly worked for the man she had married less than 12 hours earlier. "Thank you," she said quietly. Angela smiled politely and stepped back into the hallway, leaving Sarah alone again with the quiet reminder of her new life. Across the house, Alexander Reed had already begun his morning routine. His office overlooked the desert landscape stretching miles beyond the property. A large digital display glowed across one wall, filled with market updates, company reports, and news headlines that changed every few seconds. For Alexander, mornings always started the same way. Coffee, data, decisions. The events of the previous night had been significant, but in his mind they remained part of a carefully structured plan. He had spent years building companies and investments that most people could not even imagine. Creating a future family structure was simply another problem that required a solution. Victor Hale sat across from him, reviewing documents on a tablet. "Everything has been finalized," Victor said calmly. "The trust account is active, and the financial transfers have already begun." Alexander nodded once, barely looking up from the market. Projections on the screen. "And the housing arrangement?" Victor tapped the tablet. "Miss Bennett and her son will remain here for the duration of the contract unless you choose another residence." Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair. "There will be no changes for now." Victor studied him for a moment. "You understand that the public announcement will create attention. A sudden marriage always does. Alexander's expression remained neutral. Attention is temporary. Results are permanent. Victor allowed himself a small smile. As always. Meanwhile, downstairs, Sarah moved cautiously through the enormous kitchen where a quiet staff member arranged breakfast plates across a long marble counter. The house felt less like a home and more like a private hotel, every surface clean and organized in ways that made her afraid to touch anything. She poured a glass of orange juice and sat carefully at the far end of the table. For several minutes, she simply stared at the sunlight reflecting off the counter while her thoughts drifted back to Liam. Her son had spent the night at the hospital under observation after another round of medical testing. The doctors had insisted he remain there one more day. Normally, Sarah would have slept in a chair beside his bed, but the events of the auction had forced her to leave. The guilt still weighed heavily in her chest. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You should eat." Sarah turned quickly. Alexander Reed stood in the doorway, dressed in a simple dark suit as if the morning had already been planned down to the minute. She realized this was the first time they had spoken outside the contract room. "Good morning," she said quietly. Alexander nodded once and stepped toward the counter, pouring himself coffee. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The silence felt strange, like two strangers who had accidentally ended up sharing the same space. Finally, Sarah gathered the courage to ask the question that had been circling her thoughts all morning. "When can I bring my son here?" Alexander looked at her directly. "As soon as the doctors approve it." The answer came without hesitation. "His records have already been transferred to a private medical team." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Already?" Alexander took a sip of coffee. "Efficiency matters." The simple statement carried no arrogance, only certainty. Sarah realized that while she had spent the entire night trying to process what had happened, Alexander Reed had already moved forward with the next steps. For him, the agreement was not something emotional. It was something practical. Yet as he set the coffee cup down and turned toward the office again, he paused briefly at the doorway. "Your son," he said without turning around. "What is his name?" Sarah felt a small smile appear despite everything that had happened. "Liam." Alexander nodded once, committing the name to memory before continuing down the hallway. Neither of them could have known that the small boy whose name had just been spoken would soon change everything about the future Alexander Reed believed he had carefully planned. 2 days later, the quiet rhythm of the Reed estate changed the moment a black SUV rolled slowly through the front gates carrying a small passenger who had no idea his life was about to transform forever. Sarah Bennett sat in the back seat beside her 6-year-old son Liam, gently adjusting the thin blanket around his shoulders as the car moved along the long curved driveway. The boy pressed his face against the window, wide eyes studying the massive property that seemed to stretch endlessly across the desert landscape. Tall palm trees lined the road like silent guards, and the large modern house ahead looked more like a private resort than a home. Liam turned toward his mother with the curious excitement only a child could carry. "Mom, is this where we live now?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. The question still felt strange, even in her own mind. "Yes," she said softly, brushing his hair away from his forehead. "For now, this is our new home." Liam leaned forward again, staring out the window as the car stopped in front of the entrance. 2 staff members opened the doors before Sarah even had time to reach for the handle. The sudden attention made her feel awkward again, the same way she had felt during breakfast the morning before. But Liam simply stepped out of the car and looked up at the towering glass entrance with open amazement. "This place is huge," he said quietly. Sarah smiled despite the nervous knot in her chest. "Just remember your manners," she whispered gently. "Always." Inside the house, the sunlight poured through tall windows that stretched nearly from floor to ceiling, filling the space with warm desert light. Angela, the same assistant who had greeted Sarah the day before, walked forward with a welcoming smile. "Welcome back, Miss Bennett," she said politely. Then she crouched slightly, so her voice felt less formal when speaking to the boy. "And you must be Liam." Liam nodded shyly but managed a small smile. "Yes, ma'am." Angela gestured toward the living area. "Mr. Reed is finishing a call in his office. He asked me to show you around while he finishes." Sarah followed slowly, still adjusting to the idea that this enormous house now belonged partly to her life. The rooms seemed endless, connected by wide hallways and open spaces designed with simple elegance rather than flashy luxury. Liam's curiosity grew with every step. He examined everything carefully, from the polished staircase to a large wall filled with framed photographs of cities and landscapes from around the world. "Did Mr. Reed take these pictures?" Liam asked quietly. Angela smiled. "Most of them. He travels quite a bit." Liam nodded thoughtfully, clearly impressed. Meanwhile, upstairs, Alexander Reed ended a conference call and stood silently beside the large window in his office. From there he could see the driveway where the SUV had arrived moments earlier. Victor Hale sat across from the desk reviewing several reports. "Your new arrangement seems to be progressing smoothly," Victor said calmly. Alexander watched the courtyard below for a moment before responding. "The child arrived today." Victor raised an eyebrow slightly. "Already?" Alexander nodded once. "His name is Liam." Victor closed the tablet in his hands. "You plan to meet him today?" Alexander considered the question for a moment. For years he had approached every important decision with logic and distance. Personal attachments had always complicated efficiency. Yet this situation was different. The entire purpose of the agreement involved family. "Yes," he said finally. Downstairs, Liam had just discovered the enormous backyard visible through the glass walls of the living room. A long swimming pool reflected the sunlight like a mirror, and beyond it the desert hills stretched quietly toward the horizon. The boy pressed both hands against the glass. "Mom, look at this." Sarah walked beside him and could not help smiling at his excitement. Seeing him happy after months of hospital visits felt like a small miracle. At that moment, footsteps sounded from the hallway behind them. Liam turned around first. Alexander Reed stood a few feet away, observing the scene with the calm composure that always surrounded him. Sarah felt the familiar tension return immediately. "Liam," she said gently, "this is Mr. Reed." The boy studied the tall man in the dark suit with careful curiosity. Alexander stepped forward slowly, lowering himself slightly so he was not towering above the child. "Hello, Liam," he said in a calm voice. Liam nodded politely. "Hello." There was a brief pause while both of them quietly observed each other. Something about the boy's eyes seemed familiar in a way Alexander could not immediately explain. The child's expression carried a thoughtful calmness uncommon for someone his age. Liam spoke again first. "Mom said you helped us move here." Alexander nodded once. "Yes." Liam considered that answer seriously. "Thank you." The simple gratitude caught Alexander slightly off guard. Most adults he dealt with rarely spoke so directly. "You are welcome," he replied. Sarah watched the moment carefully, uncertain how this new connection would unfold. But what none of them realized yet was that the quiet introduction between a billionaire and a small boy in a sunlit living room would soon reveal a truth powerful enough to change everything Alexander Reed believed about the future he had carefully planned. The first evening inside the Reed estate passed more quietly than Sarah Bennett expected, yet the silence carried a strange tension that none of them fully understood. The desert sun slowly dropped behind the distant mountains, turning the sky outside the enormous glass windows into a warm mixture of orange and soft purple. Inside the house, the lights switched on automatically, casting a gentle glow across the living room where Liam sat cross-legged on the floor, studying a small mechanical puzzle someone from the staff had given him earlier. The boy turned the pieces carefully in his hands, concentrating with the serious focus he often showed during his hospital therapy exercises. Across the room, Sarah watched him with relief. For the first time in months, Liam looked relaxed. There were no medical machines nearby, no waiting rooms, no doctors discussing treatment schedules. Just a quiet house, and a child finally allowed to feel like a child again. Alexander Reed stood near the window with a tablet in his hand, reviewing several messages from his company. Yet despite the glowing screen in front of him, his attention kept drifting toward the small boy. On the floor, something about Liam's presence unsettled his usual sense of control. Alexander had built entire industries by predicting outcomes and controlling variables. Every major decision in his life followed logic and measurable results. But children did not follow formulas, and the quiet curiosity in Liam's eyes earlier that afternoon had stayed with him longer than expected. Liam suddenly looked up from the puzzle and noticed Alexander standing near the window. The boy tilted his head slightly, studying him the way children often observe adults when trying to understand them. "Do you work a lot?" Liam asked in a calm voice. The question was simple, yet it broke the silence in a way no adult conversation had that day. Alexander lowered the tablet slightly. Yes, he answered honestly. Liam nodded slowly as if confirming an idea he had already formed. My mom works a lot too, he said. At the diner she stands all day. Sarah glanced toward them from the couch, surprised that Liam had started a conversation so easily. Alexander considered the statement for a moment. Standing all day is difficult, he replied. Liam returned to his puzzle pieces, turning one carefully before speaking again. Mom says hard work makes things better. The boy paused before adding quietly, but sometimes things stay hard anyway. The words carried a depth that caught Alexander off guard. Most children Liam's age spoke about cartoons or toys. This boy spoke with the calm acceptance of someone who had already learned that life could be complicated. Alexander set the tablet down on the nearby table. Your mother seems determined, he said. Liam smiled slightly without looking up. She is. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and sadness hearing her son speak that way. The past year had forced Liam to grow up faster than she ever wanted. Medical appointments, long drives to specialists, and the constant uncertainty about his health had become part of their normal routine. But now everything was different. The contract she signed had changed their path in ways she still struggled to understand. At that moment, Angela entered the room carrying a small tray with 3 glasses of water and a plate of fruit slices. Liam immediately looked up with curiosity. That looks good, he said politely. Angela laughed softly. You may have some if you like. Liam took a few apple slices and thanked her with careful manners Sarah had taught him since he was little. Alexander watched the exchange quietly. Small moments like this had never existed in his life before. His childhood had been filled with private tutors, business mentors, and strict expectations about success. The simple warmth of a child enjoying fruit in a quiet living room felt oddly unfamiliar. After finishing the puzzle, Liam stood up and walked toward the window beside Alexander. The desert night had fully arrived now, and the distant lights of Phoenix shimmered far beyond the hills. This place is really big, Liam said softly. Do you ever get lonely here? The question was unexpected enough to make Sarah glance toward them immediately. For several seconds Alexander did not answer. The boy's voice held no judgment, only curiosity. Finally Alexander spoke quietly. Sometimes. Liam seemed satisfied with the honesty. Mom says houses feel bigger when people inside care about each other. Sarah felt her breath catch slightly at the innocent comment. Alexander looked down at the child beside him, studying the thoughtful expression on Liam's face. The boy's eyes reflected the city lights outside, and again that strange sense of familiarity returned. It was not something Alexander could explain, but the feeling lingered quietly in the back of his mind. Across the room Sarah noticed the moment too, though she did not fully understand why it felt significant. For now everything seemed calm. The contract was signed, the house was quiet, and Liam appeared happy in a way she had not seen for months. Yet somewhere beneath the surface of this peaceful evening, a truth waited patiently to be discovered. Because the connection Alexander Reed felt when he looked at Liam was not imagination. It was the first quiet signal of a secret hidden in the past, a secret that would soon reveal that the future he believed he purchased at an auction had already been written years before he ever met Sarah Bennett. The next morning arrived with a calm desert breeze moving softly across the wide glass walls of the Reed estate, and for the first time since the contract had been signed the house felt almost peaceful. Sunlight poured into the dining area where Liam sat at the long marble table with a small notebook and a box of colored pencils that Angela had brought him earlier. The boy leaned over the paper with careful concentration, occasionally sticking out his tongue slightly the way children often do when they focus on something important. Across the room Sarah watched him while sipping coffee, still adjusting to the surreal idea that this enormous home now belonged to their daily life. Only a week earlier she had been balancing diner shifts and hospital visits. Now her son had access to private doctors, quiet spaces, and more security than she had ever imagined. For a moment Sarah allowed herself to breathe without worry. But in the hallway beyond the kitchen Alexander Reed stood, with Victor Hale, reviewing the latest reports from the medical specialists assigned to Liam. The tablet in Victor's hand displayed several pages of test results that had been collected since Liam arrived at the estate. The medical team has completed the first round of evaluations, Victor said calmly. They believe his condition is manageable with proper treatment. Alexander nodded once while scanning the screen. Schedule whatever is necessary. Victor studied the numbers again before adding quietly, "There is something unusual, however." Alexander looked up. "Unusual?" Victor turned the tablet slightly so Alexander could see one particular line highlighted in the report. The lead doctor recommended a genetic comparison test. Alexander's expression remained calm, though the suggestion caught his attention. Why would that be necessary? Victor adjusted his glasses slightly. According to the doctor, Liam shares several rare markers commonly used in hereditary research studies. It may simply be coincidence, but the physician suggested comparing the child's DNA with potential donor databases. Alexander considered this information silently. The words meant little at first, yet the strange familiarity he had felt when speaking with Liam the night before returned unexpectedly. The boy's calm eyes, the thoughtful way he spoke. Something about the child had unsettled his usual sense of logic. "Run the test," Alexander said finally. Victor nodded. "Of course." Meanwhile, in the dining area, Liam proudly held up his notebook as Sarah approached the table. "Look, Mom," he said with excitement. "I drew the house." The drawing showed a large rectangle with tall windows and a long swimming pool behind it. In the corner of the picture, Liam had added 3 small stick figures standing together beneath a bright yellow sun. Sarah leaned down to examine the page. "This is wonderful," she said softly. "Who are these people?" Liam pointed carefully at each figure. "That is you. That is me." Then he hesitated slightly before tapping the third figure beside them. "And that is Mr. Reed." Sarah felt a small smile appear despite the complicated situation surrounding their lives. "Why did you draw him with us?" Liam shrugged casually. "He lives here too." The child's simple explanation carried a kind of innocent logic that adults often forget. Sarah closed the notebook gently. "You should thank him later for helping us stay here." Liam nodded seriously. "I will." At that moment, Alexander stepped into the room. His expression remained composed as always, but his eyes briefly rested on the notebook in Liam's hands. "Good morning," he said. Liam immediately straightened his posture. "Good morning, sir." Alexander walked closer to the table. "What are you drawing?" Liam opened the notebook again and showed him the picture proudly. Alexander studied the page longer than expected. The drawing was simple, but the 3 figures standing together caught his attention in a way he could not easily explain. "You included me," Alexander said quietly. Liam nodded. "You helped us. Mom says that matters." The boy's words were delivered with complete sincerity. For a moment, Alexander did not respond. His entire life had been built on transactions, investments, and strategic decisions. Gratitude expressed so simply felt almost unfamiliar. Finally, he nodded slightly. "Thank you." Liam seemed pleased with the response and returned to coloring the drawing. Across the room, Sarah noticed something unusual in Alexander's expression. It was subtle, but for the first time since the auction, she sensed that the billionaire was not simply observing them as part of a contract arrangement. Something about Liam's presence seemed to be shifting the carefully controlled distance Alexander usually maintained from everyone around him. But neither Sarah nor Alexander knew that at that very moment a laboratory technician across the city had just received the DNA samples requested earlier that morning. Within hours, the test results would begin processing through the system. And when those results finally appeared, they would reveal a truth so unexpected that it would change everything Alexander Reed believed about the contract, the child, and the future he thought he had purchased with $5 million. 2 days after the genetic samples were sent to the laboratory, the quiet rhythm of the Reed estate continued as if nothing unusual was happening. Yet beneath that calm routine, something significant was already moving toward the surface. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the polished floors of Alexander Reed's private office as he sat behind the wide desk reviewing financial reports that had arrived from his company headquarters in San Francisco. Numbers moved across the screen in precise columns, investment projections rising and falling exactly as his analysts had predicted. For most people, the information would have been overwhelming, but Alexander processed it with the same calm focus that had built his fortune over the last decade. Yet even as he worked, a small part of his attention drifted toward the memory of the conversation he had with Liam earlier that morning. The boy's drawing of the house still rested on the corner of the desk where Liam had left it. 3 small stick figures stood beneath a bright yellow sun. The drawing was simple, but something about it had remained in Alexander's mind throughout the day. He studied it again briefly before returning his focus to the screen. A soft knock interrupted the quiet concentration of the room. "Come in," Alexander said without looking up. Victor Hale stepped inside, carrying his tablet with an expression that was noticeably more serious than usual. Alexander immediately recognized the difference. Victor rarely showed emotion during routine business discussions. "The laboratory report has arrived," Victor said carefully. Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair. "That was faster than expected." Victor nodded. "The doctors requested priority processing." He walked closer to the desk and placed the tablet in front of Alexander before speaking again. "You should read this yourself." Alexander glanced down at the screen. Several lines of technical language appeared at the top of the report, followed by a highlighted conclusion near the center of the page. For a moment his expression did not change. Then his eyes narrowed slightly as he read the numbers again. "This cannot be correct," he said quietly. Victor remained calm, but did not disagree. The laboratory ran the comparison 3 times to confirm accuracy. Alexander looked back at the screen. The sentence was clear and impossible to misunderstand. The genetic markers in Liam's DNA showed a 99.9% match with Alexander Reed's own genetic profile. The silence in the room grew heavier with every passing second. For years Alexander had trusted data more than emotions, but this result did not follow any logical scenario he could immediately explain. "Explain this," he said finally. Victor folded his hands behind his back. "There are only a few possibilities." Alexander did not look away from the tablet. "Continue." Victor spoke carefully, choosing his words with precision. "According to the medical records we obtained earlier, Miss Bennett participated in a fertility program approximately 7 years ago." Alexander's gaze lifted slowly. "A fertility program?" Victor nodded. "A donor-based research program connected to several universities and private laboratories." Alexander's mind moved quickly through his own history, searching for connections. Then a distant memory surfaced. Nearly 8 years earlier, before his company had grown into a global empire, he had been approached by a research foundation conducting a genetic health study. At the time, he had agreed to provide biological samples as part of a confidential donor database designed to help couples struggling with fertility complications. The decision had seemed insignificant then. A simple scientific contribution. Something anonymous. Something forgotten almost immediately afterward. Victor continued quietly. "The database used by that research program appears to match the genetic markers found in Liam's test results." The room fell silent again as the meaning of the information settled into place. Alexander slowly leaned back in his chair, processing the implications with the same careful discipline he used when evaluating billion-dollar investments. The contract, the auction, the child living under his roof. None of it had been part of his original plan. Yet the evidence now sitting on his desk suggested a truth that changed everything. Victor finally spoke again. "If the laboratory findings are correct, then Liam is not simply Miss Bennett's son." Alexander closed his eyes briefly before opening them again. "He is my son." The words hung in the quiet office like a realization neither of them had expected to face. Downstairs in the living room, Liam laughed as Angela showed him how to control the small remote car she had found in one of the storage cabinets. Sarah watched the boy race the toy across the marble floor while the warm evening light filled the house. For the first time in years, she felt a fragile sense of stability. Yet only a few rooms away, Alexander Reed stared at the genetic report that had just rewritten the meaning of the contract he believed he had carefully designed. Because the boy playing with a toy car in the living room was not simply part of an agreement between 2 adults. He was the son Alexander never knew he already had. Alexander Reed remained seated behind his desk long after Victor Hale left the office, yet the numbers on the financial reports in front of him no longer held any meaning. The only document that mattered now was the genetic report glowing quietly on the tablet beside the desk. 99.9% probability. The result was clear, scientific, and impossible to dismiss. For the first time in many years, Alexander Reed found himself facing a situation he had never planned for. His entire life had been built on preparation and control. Every investment, every partnership, every expansion of his company had followed careful analysis and strategy. But this discovery did not belong to the world of business. This discovery belonged to the unpredictable world of human life. Slowly he stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the desert hills beyond the estate. Evening sunlight was beginning to fade, turning the sky into soft shades of gold and purple. Somewhere downstairs Liam was still playing, unaware that his presence had just changed the future of the man who now watched the horizon in silence. Alexander's mind returned to the memory Victor had mentioned earlier. 8 years ago, he had agreed to participate in a confidential research program supporting fertility science. At the time, the decision had seemed small and distant from his daily life. He had provided biological samples, signed several forms, and then returned to building his company without thinking about it again. The donation had been anonymous, part of a medical database designed to help couples who could not conceive naturally. Yet somehow that forgotten decision had connected his life to Sarah Bennett years before the auction ever took place. Alexander closed his eyes briefly as the realization settled deeper into his thoughts. The contract he had arranged had been built around the idea of creating a future child. But the future he planned already existed. Downstairs, Sarah Bennett was sitting on the living room sofa watching Liam drive the small remote control car across the smooth marble floor. The boy laughed each time the toy spun too quickly and bumped gently against the wall before turning around again. Sarah felt a quiet relief seeing him so full of energy. For months, Liam had struggled with exhaustion from medical treatments and long hospital visits. Yet here inside the calm environment of the Reed estate, he seemed stronger, more relaxed, almost like the child he had been before his health problems began. Angela entered the room carrying a small tray of snacks and placed it on the coffee table. "He seems happy here," she said with a soft smile. Sarah nodded while watching Liam guide the car through an imaginary race track between the furniture. "He has not laughed like this in a long time," she admitted quietly. Angela glanced toward the staircase leading to Alexander's office before lowering her voice slightly. "Mr. Reed has arranged for the best doctors in the state to review Liam's treatment plan." Sarah looked surprised. "Already?" Angela nodded. "He moves quickly when something matters to him." The words lingered in Sarah's mind as she watched her son continue playing. She still struggled to understand the man she had married through a contract only days earlier. Alexander Reed spoke little, yet every action he took carried a quiet sense of purpose. Upstairs, Alexander remained standing near the window, but now his attention had shifted away from the desert horizon toward a deeper question forming in his mind. If Liam was truly his biological son, then the situation surrounding the contract had changed completely. The agreement he had created was no longer just a transaction. It involved a child who shared his own blood. Victor had suggested speaking with Sarah immediately, but Alexander had refused for the moment. Before confronting the situation, he needed to understand the full truth. Did Sarah know about the donor program when she used it years ago? Or had she simply been one of thousands of patients participating in a medical procedure without knowing the identity of the donor? The difference mattered. Alexander returned to the desk and picked up the tablet again. The report remained unchanged. The data was absolute. Downstairs, Liam's laughter echoed softly through the hallway as the remote control car zipped across the floor one more time. The sound reached the office door just faintly enough for Alexander to hear it. For several seconds, he stood there listening. The realization settled slowly but clearly in his mind. The child whose laughter echoed through the house was not just part of a contract arrangement. The child was his son, and soon he would have to decide whether to reveal the truth that had been hidden inside a medical database for nearly 7 years. Alexander Reed did not sleep much that night. The quiet halls of the estate remained still long after midnight, but the truth revealed in the laboratory report refused to leave his mind. For years he had built his life around certainty. Every major decision followed logic, every risk measured before it was taken. Yet the discovery that Liam was his biological son had arrived without warning, rewriting the meaning of everything that had happened since the auction. Shortly after sunrise, Alexander stood once again in his office, the early desert light spreading across the wide glass windows. The genetic report remained open on the desk exactly where he had left it. 99.9% probability. The results still felt surreal even after hours of quiet reflection. A soft knock sounded on the door. "Come in," Alexander said. Victor Hale stepped inside, carrying a folder with additional documents gathered overnight. His expression suggested that he had also spent the night considering the implications of the report. I contacted the fertility research program mentioned in the medical records, Victor explained calmly. They confirmed that Sarah Bennett was enrolled as a participant 7 years ago. Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair. Did they reveal the donor information? Victor nodded once. The program uses anonymous identification numbers, but the genetic markers from their database match the sample you provided when you volunteered as a donor 8 years ago. The confirmation removed any remaining doubt. The connection between their lives had existed long before the auction, hidden inside a medical program neither of them had thought about again. Alexander remained silent for a moment before asking the question that now mattered most. Did Sarah know the identity of the donor? Victor shook his head. No. According to the program rules, the donor identity remains confidential. She would only know that the sample came from a medically approved genetic profile. Alexander turned his chair slightly toward the window again, absorbing the final piece of information. Sarah Bennett had not come into his life through some calculated plan. The connection between them had begun years earlier through a medical decision made in desperation and hope. Downstairs, the morning routine had already begun. Liam sat at the kitchen counter eating pancakes while Angela poured him a glass of milk. Sarah stood nearby watching him with quiet relief. Each day Liam seemed stronger, his energy slowly returning after months of medical treatments. The private doctors assigned by Alexander had already scheduled additional tests, but for now Sarah allowed herself to enjoy the simple sight of her son laughing at the syrup that had accidentally spilled across the plate. Mom, Liam said between bites, do you think Mr. Reed likes pancakes? Sarah smiled slightly. I'm not sure he has time for pancakes. Liam considered that answer seriously. Maybe he should try them. The boy slid one of the pancakes onto a smaller plate with careful determination. I will bring him one. Before Sarah could stop him, Liam jumped down from the stool and carefully carried the plate toward the hallway leading to Alexander's office. Upstairs, Alexander remained deep in thought when a small knock interrupted the quiet discussion between him and Victor. Come in, Alexander said automatically. The door opened slowly and Liam stepped inside, holding the plate with both hands. I brought you breakfast, the boy said proudly. The unexpected gesture filled the room with a moment of silence. Victor glanced briefly at Alexander before stepping aside to give the child space. Alexander looked at the pancake for a moment before accepting the plate. Thank you, he said quietly. Liam nodded with satisfaction. Mom says people work better when they eat. Alexander allowed the faintest hint of a smile to appear. Your mother may be correct. Liam looked around the office curiously before noticing the tablet on the desk displaying the genetic report. The boy did not understand the numbers or medical language, but he pointed at the screen with interest. Is that important work? He asked. Alexander hesitated briefly before answering. Yes, he said slowly. It is. Liam seemed satisfied with the explanation and waved politely before leaving the room to return downstairs. The door closed gently behind him. Victor exhaled quietly. You will have to tell them eventually. Alexander looked down at the plate in his hands and then back at the glowing report on the desk. The two objects represented two different futures. One built on secrecy, the other built on truth. Outside the office window, the desert sun continued to rise, lighting the house where Sarah Bennett and her son now lived. And somewhere within that quiet morning, a decision was beginning to take shape inside Alexander Reed. A decision that would soon reveal that the child who brought him a simple pancake was not just a guest in his home, but the son he had unknowingly been connected to for nearly 7 years. That evening, the desert sky outside the Reed estate glowed with a deep orange light as the sun slowly disappeared behind the distant mountains, but inside Alexander Reed's office the air felt unusually heavy. The plate Liam had brought earlier still rested on the corner of the desk, now empty except for a faint trace of syrup. Alexander had finished the pancake without realizing it while reviewing the genetic report again and again, searching for any possibility that the result might be mistaken. Yet every line of data confirmed the same conclusion. Liam Bennett was his biological son. The quiet realization had settled into his thoughts throughout the day like a weight that refused to move. Alexander Reed had built his reputation on solving impossible problems. Yet this truth could not be negotiated or redesigned like a business contract. It already existed. Victor Hale stood near the window reviewing a second set of documents when Alexander finally spoke. How much does she know about the program? Victor understood immediately who Alexander meant. Very little, he replied calmly. The fertility program only provides basic medical information to participants. She would not know the identity of the donor. Alexander leaned back in his chair slowly. Then she never knew. Victor nodded. According to their records, she was simply one of many patients hoping for a child. The words carried a quiet simplicity that made the entire situation feel even more unexpected. Sarah Bennett had not planned to meet the donor who helped her become a mother. Yet through a series of decisions and coincidences, she had now married him through a contract created for an entirely different purpose. Downstairs in the living room, Liam sat on the floor, building a small tower with wooden blocks Angela had found in a storage cabinet earlier that afternoon. Each time he stacked another block on top, he leaned back slightly to examine the structure with careful concentration. Sarah watched him from the couch, while flipping through a notebook containing Liam's latest medical notes from the private doctors. The information looked promising. His energy levels had improved since moving into the house, and the new treatment plan seemed to be helping. For the first time in months, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a future where Liam might live without constant hospital visits. She closed the notebook gently and looked across the room again. Liam placed one final block at the top of the tower and smiled proudly. "Look, Mom," he said. "It did not fall this time." Sarah laughed softly. "You are getting better at building strong things." Liam thought about that for a moment. "Mr. Reed builds strong things too," he said. Sarah raised an eyebrow slightly. "What do you mean?" Liam pointed toward the ceiling. "Angela said he built a company that helps lots of people." Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes, he did." Liam studied the tower again before adding quietly, "Maybe he can help build our family too." Sarah felt a strange warmth in her chest hearing the innocent comment. The boy had no idea how complicated the situation truly was, yet his simple logic carried a kind of hope she had not expected. Upstairs, Alexander remained in his office for several minutes after Victor left the room. The house had grown quiet again, and the soft sound of Liam's laughter from downstairs drifted faintly through the hallway. Alexander walked toward the window and looked down into the courtyard where the evening lights had begun to glow. For years he had avoided personal attachments because they created variables that could not be controlled. Yet the child laughing downstairs shared his blood. That fact alone changed the meaning of everything. Slowly, Alexander turned away from the window and walked toward the door of his office. The decision forming in his mind no longer felt uncertain. Secrets might protect a business arrangement, but they would only damage a family. Downstairs, Sarah looked up in surprise as Alexander entered the living room. Liam immediately waved from the floor beside his tower of wooden blocks. "Mr. Reed, look what I built." Alexander stepped closer and studied the structure carefully. "That is impressive," he said honestly. Liam smiled proudly before returning to his blocks. Sarah noticed the seriousness in Alexander's expression and sensed that something important was about to be said. For several seconds he remained silent, as if choosing his words with unusual care. Finally he spoke. "Sarah," he said quietly, "there is something you need to know about Liam." The room suddenly felt very still as Sarah looked at him with confusion and concern. She had expected discussions about doctors, treatments, or the details of their unusual contract marriage. But the tone in Alexander's voice suggested something entirely different. Because the truth he was about to reveal would change not only the meaning of their agreement, but the future of the small family now sitting together in the quiet living room of the Reed estate. The living room grew quiet after Alexander Reed spoke those words, the kind of quiet that seems to slow time itself. Sarah Bennett felt her chest tighten as she looked at him across the room. Liam continued stacking his wooden blocks on the floor, unaware that the conversation about to unfold would change the story of his life. Sarah stood slowly from the couch. "What about Liam?" she asked carefully. Alexander did not answer immediately. For a man who was known for making billion-dollar decisions in seconds, the moment required more caution than any boardroom negotiation he had ever faced. He glanced briefly toward the boy building his tower and then back at Sarah. "I received a medical report today," he said quietly. Sarah felt a sudden wave of concern. "Is something wrong with his health?" Alexander shook his head slowly. "No. The doctors are optimistic about his treatment." Sarah exhaled slightly in relief, but the seriousness in Alexander's voice remained. "Then what is it?" she asked. Alexander stepped a little closer, so his voice would not carry across the room to where Liam was playing. Several days ago, the medical team ran a genetic test, he explained. They wanted to understand more about Liam's condition. Sarah nodded slowly. That makes sense. Alexander paused briefly before continuing. The test revealed something unexpected. Sarah waited, her expression filled with growing confusion. The genetic markers in Liam's DNA match mine. For a moment, Sarah simply stared at him as if she had misunderstood the words. I do not understand, she said softly. Alexander's voice remained calm but steady. 7 years ago, you participated in a fertility research program. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Yes, she said. It was the only way I could afford the treatment. Alexander nodded. The donor who provided the genetic sample for that program was me. The words settled into the room slowly, like a truth that needed time to be fully understood. Sarah blinked in disbelief. That cannot be possible, she whispered. The program was anonymous. It was, Alexander replied, until the doctors compared Liam's genetic profile with the donor database. Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward her mouth as the realization began to form in her mind. The room around her felt suddenly distant. All those years she had believed Liam's father was simply an unknown donor chosen through a medical process she barely understood. She had never imagined that the man would one day stand in front of her in the living room of a house she now lived in. You are saying, she began slowly, struggling to finish the sentence. Alexander completed it quietly. Liam is my son. Across the room, the boy finally noticed the silence and looked up from his blocks. Mom? He asked curiously. Sarah quickly turned back toward him with a gentle smile. Everything is fine, she said softly. Liam seemed satisfied with the answer and returned to stacking his tower again. But Sarah's thoughts were racing. She looked back at Alexander with a mixture of shock and disbelief. All these years I never knew, she said quietly. I thought the donor would remain a stranger forever. Alexander nodded. So did I. The honesty in his voice carried no accusation, only the quiet weight of an unexpected truth. Sarah sat down slowly on the couch again as she tried to process the meaning of what he had told her. The contract she had signed at the auction suddenly felt like part of a much larger story that had begun long before that night. That means, she said, glancing toward Liam again, the child I have been raising alone, Alexander finished the thought gently, is also my child. The two of them stood in silence for a moment while Liam placed the final block at the top of his tower. The structure wobbled slightly, but did not fall. Look, Liam said proudly. It is strong. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she looked at him. Strong. The word carried more meaning now than it had only minutes earlier. Because the truth Alexander had just revealed had transformed their unusual contract marriage into something far more complicated and far more real than either of them had expected. And for the first time since the auction, the future of their small family was no longer just a matter of agreement or money. It was a matter of blood, truth, and the question of what they would choose to build together next. For several minutes after the truth was spoken, the living room remained quiet except for the soft clicking sound of wooden blocks as Liam adjusted the small tower he had built on the floor. The boy had no idea that the conversation unfolding behind him had just reshaped the foundation of his life. Sarah Bennett sat very still on the couch, her mind struggling to absorb what Alexander Reed had revealed only moments earlier. 7 years ago, she had walked into a medical clinic filled with uncertainty and hope. She had been alone, working double shifts and saving every dollar she could, believing that becoming a mother might be the one dream she could still reach. The doctors had explained the donor program quickly, using complicated medical terms she barely understood at the time. All she knew was that the process gave her a chance to have a child, even though she could not afford expensive fertility treatments. The donor had been anonymous, just a number in a file. Yet now that anonymous number had a face, a voice, and a presence standing in the same room. Sarah slowly looked up at Alexander again. The billionaire who had purchased a contract marriage at an auction was now connected to her son through something far deeper than any legal document. You knew nothing about Liam until the test results, she said quietly. Alexander nodded. That is correct. His voice remained steady, but the weight of the situation was clear in his expression. When I volunteered as a donor years ago, it was part of a medical research program. I never expected to meet anyone connected to it. Sarah looked across the room at Liam again as he carefully balanced another block on the top of his tower. The boy's quiet concentration made the moment feel almost unreal. "And now he is here," she whispered. Alexander followed her gaze. "Yes." The word carried a meaning that neither of them fully understood yet. For years Alexander Reed had built companies, investments, and technology that influenced millions of people. But standing in the living room of his own house, he now faced something far more personal than any corporate decision. He was looking at his son. Sarah finally stood and walked slowly toward Liam. The boy looked up with a bright smile. "Mom, look how tall it is now." She knelt beside him and touched his shoulder gently. "It is very strong," she said softly. Liam glanced toward Alexander, standing a few feet away. "Mr. Reed helped too," he added. The simple statement made Sarah's heart tighten. She knew that eventually Liam would need to understand the truth about his father, but the moment still felt fragile. She turned back toward Alexander. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. The question carried many meanings. The contract they had signed, the future they had imagined, the secret that had just been revealed. Alexander took a slow breath before answering. "The contract was created because I believed I needed to build a future family," he said. "But that future already exists." Sarah studied his face carefully, searching for signs of doubt or hesitation. Instead, she saw something she had not noticed before. Responsibility. "Liam deserves honesty," Alexander continued. "And he deserves stability." Sarah nodded slowly. "He has always had stability with me." "I know," Alexander replied. "You raised him alone for 7 years. That matters." The acknowledgement surprised her more than she expected. For years, Sarah had carried the challenges of single motherhood without recognition from anyone except the small boy who depended on her every day. Hearing those words from the man, now standing in front of her, felt strangely comforting. Liam suddenly clapped his hands as the tower reached its final height without falling. "It stayed up," he said proudly. Sarah laughed softly. "Yes, it did." Alexander stepped closer and looked down at the tower of wooden blocks. "Strong foundations make that possible," he said. Liam nodded seriously. "That is what Mom always says." The boy then looked between the two adults standing near him. "Are you both going to help build more things here?" he asked innocently. Sarah and Alexander exchanged a brief glance. The question sounded simple, yet it touched the heart of everything they had just discovered. After a moment, Alexander answered gently. "Yes," he said. "We are." Outside the tall windows, the desert night had fully arrived, and the lights of the city shimmered in the distance like thousands of small stars. Inside the house, the quiet presence of a child and 2 adults standing beside him marked the beginning of a future none of them had planned, because the contract that brought them together had been written with money and legal terms. But the truth that now connected them had been written years earlier through a single decision, a hidden donor file, and a little boy who had unknowingly brought a family together long before anyone realized it. The desert morning arrived quietly over the Reed estate as golden sunlight spread across the wide glass windows and warmed the marble floors of the living room where a new routine was beginning to form. Several weeks had passed since the night Alexander Reed revealed the truth about Liam, and the house that once felt like a temporary arrangement now carried a growing sense of real life inside its walls. In the kitchen, Sarah Bennett stood beside the counter pouring orange juice, while Liam sat at the table finishing his breakfast. The boy's energy had returned steadily as his new treatment plan continued to help his health improve, and the sound of his laughter had become one of the most familiar parts of the house each morning. Across the room, Alexander reviewed messages on his tablet while drinking coffee, yet his attention frequently shifted toward the small conversation happening between mother and son at the table. Only a short time earlier, he had been a man who built companies and negotiated international deals without thinking twice. Now he found himself paying attention to things that had never existed in his world before, like the way Liam carefully stacked his pancakes before eating them, or the way Sarah reminded him to finish his milk before running outside. The change had not happened overnight, but it had become impossible to ignore. Victor Hale had once told Alexander that business success required discipline and distance, yet fatherhood required something entirely different. Liam suddenly slid off his chair and walked toward the living room window where the desert sunlight filled the space with bright warmth. "Mr. Reed," he called with excitement, "look at the backyard." Alexander stood and joined him beside the glass. Outside, the swimming pool reflected the clear blue sky, and beyond it the quiet hills stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The tower I built yesterday is still there, Liam said proudly, pointing toward a small structure of wooden blocks he had carefully arranged on the patio the day before. Alexander nodded. You built it well. Liam crossed his arms thoughtfully the way he often did when thinking about something important. Strong foundations, he said, repeating the phrase Alexander had mentioned earlier. Sarah watched the moment from the kitchen doorway with a quiet smile. Weeks ago the two of them had been strangers connected only by a contract and an unexpected discovery. Now the connection between them looked far more natural. Liam turned back toward both adults with the open curiosity that children often carry. Mom, he asked, are we staying here forever? Sarah glanced briefly at Alexander before answering carefully. We are staying as long as it feels like home. Liam nodded as if the answer made perfect sense. To him, the large house was simply a place where people cared about him. But for Sarah, the decision carried deeper meaning. After learning the truth about Liam's father, she had expected the situation to become complicated or distant. Instead, Alexander had chosen something she never anticipated. He had chosen responsibility. Over the past weeks, he had arranged the best medical specialists, adjusted his demanding work schedule, and spent more time in the house than anyone expected. Not because the contract required it, but because the boy laughing in the backyard was his son. Alexander looked toward Sarah across the room and spoke quietly. The legal team has updated the documents. Sarah walked closer. What kind of documents? Alexander set the tablet down on the table beside him. The contract we signed at the auction has been dissolved. Sarah felt a small moment of surprise, even though part of her had sensed this decision coming. You are ending the agreement? Alexander nodded. Yes. It was written for a situation that no longer exists. Liam watched the conversation with mild curiosity, but quickly returned his attention to the backyard tower. Sarah looked back at Alexander. Then what happens now? Alexander considered the question carefully before answering. For the first time since the night of the auction, his voice carried something warmer than careful strategy. Now we build something real. Sarah studied his expression and realized that the billionaire who once approached life like a business plan had quietly changed. Not because of money, contracts, or expectations, but because a small boy had unknowingly brought a family into existence long before any of them realized it. Outside the window, Liam raised his arms proudly as the small tower remained standing against the morning breeze. Inside the house, Sarah and Alexander stood beside each other, watching him with a quiet understanding that the future they were about to create would not be written by legal agreements or auction bids, but by the simple decision to remain together and build the strong foundation Liam believed in all along.